that we're in a period that is arguably more dangerous than the first Cold War, because we live under a regime dominated by the influence of an arrogant national security elite that mocks the notion of nuclear retaliation from Russia while it mulls first strike attacks on Moscow via its Ukrainian proxy. And where this same national security elite surveys the wreckage it brought to the Arab Middle East and then proceeds to intensify the aerial bridge of heavy weapons that it ships to Israel to carpet bomb the besieged Gaza Strip, to assail southern Lebanon, attack Yemen, conduct assassinations inside Iran, and drag the region closer to total war. The unprecedented danger of this scenario is not only the result of the absence of a Brahmin-like charismatic JFK figure who would be willing to confront the national security state and turn back the doomsday clock. It's really the result of the absence of the conditions that produced the JFK who appeared at American University in June 1963 to deliver that peace speech. Our national security elites still exist in the delusional haze of the period of high unipolarity that prevailed after the end of the first Cold War. And it therefore has no fear, as Kennedy did, of mortality or the kind of mass death brought by a total nuclear war. It doesn't even fear real consequences for the belligerent actions it has been carrying out since the end of the Cold War, which this national security elite, helmed at the time by longtime CIA director George H.W. Bush, arrogantly and falsely declared as a U.S. victory rather than a triumph alongside the Soviet Union for peace, for diplomacy, without total war. And so they set the stage for a second Cold War with this narrative. The narrative included the sense that the US had defeated the Soviet Union through the largest CIA operation in history, Operation Cyclone, conducted in Afghanistan, which saw the CIA pump $1.5 billion into the Afghan Mujahideen, working with the British MI6 and the Saudi monarchy, which put up a matching fund to bring foreign fighters to the battlefield, who included a network of Wahhabi fanatics who based themselves across the border in Peshawar and then set up a base in Khost in Afghanistan, which became the inspiration for the name of the organization that they founded after the Red Army retreated from Afghanistan. They called it Al-Qaeda, which simply means the base. Their financier was Osama bin Laden, who returned as a hero to Saudi Arabia, which then promptly hosted American troops and forged a special alliance with the United States. Of course, this set the stage for incredible blowback. It was a time of the 1990s when everyone basked in, I remember these times during the Clinton era, we basked in what we thought was peace and prosperity. And the national security elite, which was comfortable under a figure like Bill Clinton, who had done the CIA's bidding by, for example, allowing it to use airfields in Mena, Arkansas, to ship drugs to and from Central America, along with bags of cash, during which they adopted the Wolfowitz Doctrine, a doctrine composed by a young neoconservative staffer in George H.W. Bush's Pentagon, which preached that any challenge to the U.S. system and U.S. hegemony must be crushed with absolute force and violence, and that the diversity in international relations that Kennedy yearned for should be rejected. The Wolfowitz Doctrine was the guiding light for all administrations after the end of the Cold War. And it informed the regime change wars that Bill Clinton presided over in the former Yugoslavia, transforming a formerly stable, diverse, and prosperous socialist country into a series of balkanized right-wing republics, including Kosovo, run by the al-Qaeda-tied, drug and narco-infested KLA, which received backing from the CIA and MI6. Clinton set about laying the groundwork for the Iraq War with the Iraq Liberation Act in Congress, funding kind of mujahideen in Iraq with federal money and sanctioning Iraq into oblivion, leaving, according to Madeleine Albright herself, hundreds of thousands of children dead. 9/11 was the blowback for the covert operations that the US waged in Afghanistan to, in its view, end the Cold War, and all the way to the completion of the Day of the Plains operation waged by al-Qaeda operatives. A rogue unit within the CIA known as Alex Station ran cover for two key figures who would become hijackers on 9/11, who were also being ferried around the United States and sponsored by Saudi intelligence with the full knowledge of this rogue unit. Their names were Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, and they both helped fly a plane into the US Pentagon. And they were CIA recruits, as we now know. The CIA refused to tell the FBI's Bin Laden unit about their presence or even to open a criminal investigation. And the members of that Alex Station have since been promoted and even inspired protagonists for Hollywood blockbuster films like Zero Dark 30. John F. Kennedy, in his peace speech, declared that the United States will never start a war. The Bush administration, the second Bush administration, which brought neoconservatives like Paul Wolfowitz back into the building, turned that on its head when they attacked Iraq as punishment for an attack on the United States that Iraq had nothing to do with. Why did we attack Iraq? It was simple. As Michael Ledeen, the neoconservative, spelled out in his Ledeen Doctrine, which was also articulated by the neoliberal columnist, Thomas Friedman during a Charlie Rose interview, the United States simply had to go somewhere in the Arab world, throw Arabs against the wall and scare them and tell them, suck on this, in the words of Thomas Friedman. This straightforward, racist logic defied the guidance and wise counsel of JFK in his peace speech to respect the people and cultures, even of countries that the United States government considers adversaries. And it led not only to the maiming and deaths of thousands of American citizens, but to the rise of ISIS, one of the most fanatical nihilistic forces to rise in the Middle East since the foundation of Israel. The so-called Arab Spring, which erupted during the Obama administration, became cover for the West and its theocratic Gulf partners to destroy the remnants of Arab nationalism which challenged Israel. First, they moved in on Gaddafi, because unlike Fidel Castro, who invited Soviet missiles onto Cuban territory as a deterrent against an inevitable US invasion, and who guaranteed his survival under the Soviet protective umbrella, Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program in exchange for promises from the West for economic normalization. Trusting his Western partners proved to be fatal. As soon as they flooded his country with weapons under the guise of a non-existent peaceful rebellion against his strong man rule, he was powerless to prevent anything. He was powerless to deter the West. The weapons wound up immediately in the hands of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was being run by the MI6 and French intelligence, and which was a longtime al-Qaeda affiliate. And towards the end, Gaddafi found himself on the phone with Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, who helped oversee the normalization deal between Libya and the West. And he told Blair that if he was overthrown, not only would the Libyan Islamic fighting group take over, but an ISIS-like entity would establish a caliphate within Libyan territory. Africa would be flooded with Libyan weapons and large swaths of the continent would be destabilized. And Europe would be flooded with migrants from the African continent. After Gaddafi was sodomized and bayoneted to death by al-Qaeda affiliates operating directly under NATO air cover, his darkest prophecies came true. And worse, a young man who was brought by the MI6 from a cell it was running in Manchester, England, to fight Gaddafi, Salam Abedi, and who was returned to the UK on a Royal Navy ship, carried out the worst terrorist attack on British soil in history, slaughtering girls at an Ariana Grande concert in 2016. Today, Libyan arms have destabilized Africa, leading to attacks in Mali just yesterday in Bamako and Burkina Faso, where popular coups to remove the French security forces that have allowed these attacks to take place for years and which participated directly in the Libyan regime change operation have taken place. The next on the chopping block for the national security elite, the regime change hungry national security elite, was Syria. And Syria was directly connected to Libya through Benghazi, where an ambassador, a US ambassador named Christopher Stevens, had traveled to a US consulate to help manage arms shipments from Libyan military depots to the so-called Syrian rebels, the Free Syrian Army being run by the CIA, and where he was killed in that consulate by the jihadist mobs that Gaddafi had warned about. Another case of blowback. The CIA-backed Free Syrian Army promptly became a weapons farm for al-Qaeda's local affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra, and the ISIS bandits who arose out of the destruction of Iraq and spread across the border, and whose advance, as admitted by former Secretary of State John Kerry, was managed by Washington and London. And it was only thanks to an intervention by Russia and Iran, our designated enemies, beginning in 2015, that the forces of al-Qaeda were defeated and Syrians, average Syrians, in places like Damascus and Aleppo, could live free of perpetual terror. But in the eyes of the US national security state, the sacrifice of tens of thousands of Syrian soldiers and the contributions of Russia and Iran to defeat the organization responsible for the 9/11 attacks, which threatened to overrun Lebanon as well, was a great crime which had to be avenged, which is why Donald Trump authorized the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general who oversaw the defeat of ISIS and al-Qaeda in large parts of Syria. The destabilization of Syria and destruction of Libya and Iraq were accompanied by a series of migrant crises, which triggered the rise of right-wing parties in Europe, Brexit, and the gradual collapse of the European Union. These were all consequences of Washington's refusal to recognize the right of other political systems to exist anywhere in the world. So today, swaths of Syria lay in ruins, and in the areas formerly controlled by ISIS in northeastern Syria, where ISIS stole oil and sold it on the black market, these areas ISIS has been conveniently replaced by the US military and its Kurdish proxies, which steal Syria's oil and sell it on the black market just as ISIS did. It's a criminal pirate occupation regime whose existence is still unknown by most Americans following horse race politics.